The annexation of Portuguese India was an action by the Indian armed forces that ended the rule of Portugal in its exclaves in India in 1961. The armed action, codenamed Operation Vijay, involved air, sea and land strikes for over 36 hours, and was a decisive victory for India, ending 451 years of Portuguese overseas provincial governance in Goa. The war lasted 2 days and 22 Indians and 30 Portuguese were killed in the fighting. The brief conflict drew a mixture of worldwide praise and condemnation. In India, the action was seen as a liberation of historically Indian territory, while Portugal viewed it as an aggression against national soil and its citizens. Background: after India's independence from the British Empire in August 1947, Portugal continued to hold a handful of exclaves on the Indian subcontinent. The districts of Goa, Daman and Diu in Dadra and Nagar Haveli, collectively known as the Estado-da India. Goa, Daman and Diu covered an area of around 1,540 square miles and held a population of 637,591. The Goan diaspora was estimated at 175,000. Religious distribution was 61% Hindus, 36.7% Christian, 2.2% Muslim. Economy was primarily based on agriculture, although the 1940s and 1950s saw a boom in mining, principally iron ore and some manganese. Local resistance to Portuguese rule in Goa in the 20th century was pioneered by Tristão de Bragança Cunha, a French-educated Goan engineer who founded the Goa Congress Committee in Portuguese India in 1928. Cunha released a booklet called 400 Years of Foreign Rule, and a pamphlet, Denationalization of Goa, intended to sensitize Goans to the oppression of Portuguese rule. Messages of solidarity were received by the Goa Congress Committee from leading figures in the Indian independence movement like Dr. Rajendra Prasad, Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhas Chandra Bose, and several others. On the 12th of October 1938, Cunha with other members of the Goa Congress Committee met Subhas Chandra Bose, the President of the Indian National Congress, and on his advice, opened a branch office of the Goa Congress Committee at 21 Dalal Street, Bombay. The Goa Congress was also made affiliate to the Indian National Congress and Cunha was selected its first president. In June 1946, Ram Manohar Lohia, an Indian socialist leader, entered Goa on a visit to his friend, Julião Menezes, a nationalist leader who had founded in Bombay the Gomantak Praja Mandal and edited the weekly newspaper, Gomantak. Cunha and other leaders were also with him. Ram Manohar Lohia advocated the use of non-violent Gandhian techniques to oppose the government. On the 18th of June 1946, the Portuguese government disrupted a protest in Panaji against the suspension of civil liberties organized by Lohia. Cunha, along with others like Purushottam Kakobka and Lakshmikant Bomba, in defiance of a ban on public gatherings and arrested them. There were intermittent mass demonstrations from June to November. In addition to non-violent protests, armed groups such as the Azad Gomantak Dal and the United Front of Goans conducted violent attacks aimed at weakening Portuguese rule in Goa. The Indian government supported the establishment of armed groups like the Azad Gomantak Dal, giving them full financial, logistic and armament support. The armed groups acted from bases situated in Indian territory and under cover of Indian police forces. The Indian government, through these armed groups, attempted to destroy economic targets, telegraph and telephone lines, road, water and rail transport, in order to impede economic activity and create conditions for a general uprising of the population. Commenting on the armed resistance, Portuguese army officer Captain Carlos Azeredo, stationed with the army in Goa, stated in the Portuguese newspaper Expresso, "To the contrary to what is being said, the most evolved guerrilla warfare which our armed forces encountered was in Goa. I know what I'm talking about, because I also fought in Angola and in Guinea. In 1961 alone, until December, around 80 policemen died. The major part of the terrorists of Azad Gomantak Dal were not Goans. Many had fought in the British Army, under General Montgomery, against the Germans." Diplomatic efforts to resolve Goa dispute. On the 27th of February 1950, the government of India asked the Portuguese government to open negotiations about the future of Portuguese colonies in India. Portugal asserted that its territory on the Indian subcontinent was not a colony but part of metropolitan Portugal, and hence its transfer was non-negotiable, and that India had no rights to this territory because the Republic of India did not exist at the time when Goa came under Portuguese rule. When the Portuguese government refused to respond to subsequent aid memoirs in this regard, the Indian government, on the 11th of June 1953, withdrew its diplomatic mission from Lisbon. By 1954, the Republic of India instituted visa restrictions on travel from Goa to India, which paralyzed transport between Goa and other exclaves like Daman, Diu, Dadra and Nagar Haveli. Meanwhile, the Indian Union of Dockers had, in 1954, instituted a boycott on shipping to Portuguese India. Between the 22nd of July and the 2nd of August 1954, armed activists attacked and forced the surrender of Portuguese forces stationed in Dadra and Nagar Haveli. On the 15th of August 1955, 5,000 unarmed Indian activists attempted to enter Goa at 6 locations and were violently repulsed by Portuguese police officers, resulting in the deaths of between 21 and 30 people. The news of the massacre built public opinion in India against the presence of the Portuguese in Goa. On the 1st of September 1955, India shut its consul office in Goa. In 1956, Portuguese ambassador to France, Marcelo Matthias, along with Portuguese Prime Minister Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, argued in favor of a referendum in Goa to determine its future. This proposal was, however, rejected by the Ministers for Defense and Foreign Affairs. The demand for a referendum was again made by presidential candidate General Humberto Delgado in 1957. Prime Minister Salazar, alarmed by India's hinted threats at armed action against its presence in Goa, first asked the United Kingdom to mediate, then protested through Brazil, and eventually asked the United Nations Security Council to intervene. Mexico offered the Indian government its influence in Latin America to bring pressure on the Portuguese to relieve tensions. Meanwhile, Krishna Menon, India's defense minister and head of India's UN delegation, stated in no uncertain terms that India had not abjured the use of force in Goa. The U.S. ambassador to India, John Kenneth Galbraith, requested the Indian government on several occasions to resolve the issue peacefully through mediation and consensus rather than armed conflict. Eventually, on the 10th of December, 9 days prior to the invasion, Nehru stated to the press that continuance of Goa under Portuguese rule is an impossibility. The American response was to warn India that if and when India's armed action in Goa was brought to the UN Security Council, it could expect no support from the U.S. delegation. On the 24th of November 1961, the Sabarmati C, a passenger boat passing between the Portuguese-held island of Anjadive and the Indian port of Kochi, was fired upon by Portuguese ground troops, resulting in injuries to the chief engineer of the boat as well as the death of a passenger. The action was precipitated by Portuguese fears that the boat carried a military landing party intent on storming the island. The incidents lent themselves to foster widespread public support in India for military action in Goa. The annexation of Dadra and Nagar Haveli. The hostilities between India and Portugal started 7 years before the invasion of Goa, when Dadra and Nagar Haveli were invaded and occupied by pro-Indian forces with the support of the Indian authorities. Dadra and Nagar Haveli were two Portuguese landlocked exclaves of the Daman district, totally surrounded by Indian territory. The connection between the exclaves and the coastal territory of Daman had to be made by crossing about 20 kilometers of Indian territory. Dadra and Nagar Haveli did not have any Portuguese military garrison, but only police forces. The Indian government started to develop isolation actions against Dadra and Nagar Haveli already in 1952, including the creation of impediments to the transit of persons and goods between the two landlocked enclaves and Daman. In July 1954, pro-Indian forces, including members of organizations like the United Front of Goans, the National Movement Liberation Organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and the Azad Gomantak Dal, with the support of Indian police forces, started to launch assaults against Dadra and Nagar Haveli. On the night of the 22nd of July, UFG forces stormed the small Dadra police station, killing Police Sergeant Aniceto de Rosario and Constable Antonio Fernandez, who resisted the attack. On the 28th of July, RSS forces took Narale police station. Meanwhile, the Portuguese authorities asked the Indian government for permission to cross the territory with reinforcements to Dadra and Nagar Haveli, which was denied. Surrounded and prevented from receiving reinforcements by the Indian authorities, the Portuguese administrator and police forces in Nagar Haveli eventually surrendered to the Indian police forces on the 11th of August 1954. Portugal appealed to the International Court of Justice, which, in the decision of the 12th of April 1960, case concerning right of passage over Indian territory, stated that Portugal had sovereign rights over the territories of Dadra and Nagar Haveli, but India had the right to deny passage to armed personnel if Portugal over Indian territories. Therefore, the Portuguese authorities could not legally pass through Indian territory. On the 31st of December 1974, a treaty was signed between India and Portugal, with the Portuguese recognizing full sovereignty of India over Goa, Daman, Diu, Dadra and Nagar Haveli. Events preceding the hostilities. Indian military build-up. On receiving the go-ahead for military action and the mandate of the capture of all occupied territories for the Indian government, Lieutenant General Chowdhury of India's Southern Army fielded the 17th Infantry Division and the 50th Parachute Brigade commanded by Major General K.P. Kanda. The assault on the enclave of Daman was assigned to the Maratha Light Infantry, 1st Battalion, while the operations in Diu were assigned to the Rajput Regiment, 20th Battalion, and the Madras Regiment, 4th Battalion. Meanwhile, the Commander-in-Chief of India's Western Air Command, Air Vice Marshal Erlich Pinto, was appointed as the commander of all air resources assigned to the operations in Goa. Air resources for the assault on Goa were concentrated in the bases at Pune and Sambra. The mandate handed to Air Vice Marshal Erlich Pinto by the Indian Air Command was listed out as follows: the destruction of Goa's lone airfield in Dabalim, without causing damage to the terminal building and other airport facilities; destruction of the wireless station at Bambolim, Goa; denial of airfields at Daman and Diu, which were, however, not to be attacked without prior permission; support to advancing ground troops. The Indian Navy deployed 2 warships, the INS Rajput, an R-class destroyer, and the INS Kirpan, a Blackwood-class anti-submarine frigate, off the coast of Goa. The actual attack on Goa was delegated to 4 task groups: a surface action group comprising 5 ships, Mysore, Trishul, Betwa, Bees and Kovri; a carrier group of 5 ships, Delhi, Gufar, Kirpan, Kukri and Rajput, centered around the light aircraft carrier Vikrant; a minesweeping group consisting of minesweepers including Karwar, Kakinada, Kannanur and Bimalipatin, and a support group which consisted of the Darini. The Portuguese mandate. In March 1960, Portuguese Defense Minister General Botelho Monas told Prime Minister Salazar that a sustained Portuguese campaign against decolonization would create for the army a suicide mission in which we could not succeed. His opinion was shared by Army Minister Colonel Almeida Fernandes, by the Army Under Secretary of State Lieutenant Colonel Costa Gomes, and by other top officers. Ignoring this advice, Salazar sent the following message to Governor-General Vasilo E. Silva in Goa on the 14th of December, in which he ordered the Portuguese forces in Goa to fight to the last man. Radio 816, Lisbon 14 Dec. 1961. You understand the bitterness with which I send you this message. It is horrible to think that this may mean total sacrifice, but I believe that sacrifice is the only way for us to keep up to the highest traditions and provide service to the future of the nation. Do not expect the possibility of truce or of Portuguese prisoners, as there will be no surrender rendered, because I feel that our soldiers and sailors can be either victorious or dead. These words could, by the seriousness, be directed only to a soldier of higher duties fully prepared to fulfill them. God will not allow you to be the last governor of the state of India. Salazar then asked Vasilo E. Silva to hold out for at least 8 days, within which time he hoped to gather international support against the Indian invasion. Portuguese military preparations. Following the annexation of Dadra and Nagar Haveli, the Portuguese authorities made a marked strengthening of the garrison of Portuguese India, with units and personnel sent from Portugal and occupied areas of Angola and Mozambique. Portuguese military preparations began in earnest in 1954, following the Indian economic blockade, the beginning of the anti-Portuguese attacks in Goa, and the invasion of Dadra and Nagar Haveli. 3 light infantry battalions and support units were transported to Goa, reinforcing a local raised battalion and increasing the Portuguese military presence there from almost nothing to 12,000 men. Other sources refer that, in the end of 1955, Portuguese forces in India represented a total of around 8,000 men, including 7,000 in the land forces, 250 in the naval forces, 600 in the police and 250 in the fiscal guard, split by the districts of Goa, Daman and Diu. The Portuguese forces were organized as the armed forces of the state of India, under a unified command headed by General Paulo Bernardo Guedes, which accumulated the civil role of Governor-General with the military role of Commander-in-Chief. General Bernardo Guedes would end his commission in 1958, with General Vasilo E. Silva being appointed to replace him in both the civil and and military roles. The Portuguese government and military commands were, however, well aware that even with this effort to strengthen the garrison of Goa, the Portuguese forces would never be sufficient to face a conventional attack from the Indian armed forces, which could easily concentrate against Third Territory land forces overwhelmingly stronger than the Portuguese ones, as well as air and naval forces. The Portuguese government hoped, however, to politically deter the Indian government from attempting a military aggression, with the showing of a Portuguese strong will to fight and to sacrifice to defend Goa. In 1960, during an inspection visit to Portuguese India and referring to a predictable start of guerrilla activities in Angola, the Under-Secretary of State of the Army Costa Gomes stated the necessity to reinforce the Portuguese military presence in that African territory, partly at the expense of the military presence in Goa, where the then existing 7,500 men were too many just to deal with anti-Portuguese actions, and too few to face an Indian invasion, which, if it were to occur, would have to be handled by other means. This led to the Portuguese forces in India suffering a sharp reduction to about 3,300 soldiers. Faced with this reduced force strength, the strategy employed to defend Goa against an Indian invasion was based in the Plano Sentinel, which divided the territory into 4 defense sectors and the Plano-De barrages, which envisaged the demolishing of all bridges and links to delay the invading army, as well as the mining of approach roads and beaches. Defense units were organized as 4 battle groups, with a battle group assigned to each sector and tasked with slowing the progression of an invading force. Commenting on the Plano Sentinel, Captain Carlos Azeredo, who was stationed in Goa at the time of hostilities, states in Portuguese newspaper Expresso on 8 December 2001, "It was a totally unrealistic and unachievable plan, which was quite incomplete. It was based on exchange of ground with time, but, for this purpose, portable communication equipment was necessary. Plans to mine roads and beaches were also unviable because of a desperate shortage of mines." Navy. The naval component of the FAI were the naval forces of the State of India, headed by the naval commander of Goa, Commodore Raul Viegas Ventura. The only significant Portuguese Navy warship present in Goa at the time of invasion was the sloop NRP Afonso de Albuquerque. The vessel was armed with 4 120mm guns capable of 2 shots per minute, and 4 automatic rapid-firing guns. In addition to the sloop, the Portuguese naval forces had 3 light patrol boats, each armed with a 20mm Helicon gun, one based in each Goa, Daman and Diu. There were also 5 merchant marine ships in Goa. An attempt by Portugal to send naval warships to Goa to reinforce its marine defenses was foiled when President Nasser of Egypt denied the ships access to the Suez Canal. Ground forces. Portuguese ground defences were organised as the land forces of the State of India, under the Portuguese Army's Independent Territorial Command of India, headed by Brigadier Antonio José Martins Leitão. At the time of the invasion, they consisted of a total of 3,995 men, including 810 native soldiers, many of whom had little military training and were utilized primarily for security and anti-extremist operations. These forces were divided amongst the 3 Portuguese enclaves in India. The Portuguese army units in Goa included 4 motorized reconnaissance squadrons, 8 rifle companies, 2 artillery batteries and an engineer detachment. In addition to the military forces, the Portuguese defences counted with the civil internal security forces of the Portuguese India. These included the State of India Police, General Police Corps modelled after the Portuguese Public Security Police, the Fiscal Guard, responsible of the customs enforcement and border protection, and the rural guard, game wardens. In 1958, as an emergency measure, the Portuguese government gave a provisional military status to Pay and the Fiscal Guard, placing them under the command of the FAI. The security forces were also divided amongst the three districts and were mostly made up of Indo-Portuguese policemen and guards. Different sources indicate between 900 and 1400 men as the total effective for these forces at the time of the invasion. Air defense. The Portuguese Air Force did not have any presence in Portuguese India, with the exception of a single officer with the role of air advisor in the office of the Commander-in-Chief. On the 16th of December, the Portuguese Air Force was placed on alert to transport 10 tons of anti-tank grenades in 2 DC-6 aircraft from Montijo Air Base in Portugal to Goa assist in its defense. When the Portuguese Air Force was unable to obtain stopover facilities at any airbase along the way, most nations, including Pakistan, denying passage of Portuguese military aircraft, the mission was passed on to the civilian airline TAP, which offered a Lockheed Constellation on charter for the job. However, when permission to transport weapons through Karachi was denied by the Pakistani government, the Lockheed Constellation landed in Goa at 1800 hours on the 17th of December with a consignment of half a dozen bags of sausages as food supplies instead of the intended grenades. However, the aircraft also arrived with a contingent of female paratroopers to assist in the evacuation of Portuguese civilians. The Portuguese air presence in Goa at the time of hostilities was thus limited to the presence of 2 civilian transport aircraft, one belonging to the Portuguese International Airline and the other to the Goan airline Portuguese India Airlines, a Lockheed Constellation and a Douglas DC-4 Skymaster aircraft. The Indians claimed that the Portuguese had a squadron of F-86 Sabres stationed at Dabalim Airport, which later turned out to be false intelligence. Air defense was limited to a few obsolete anti-aircraft guns manned by 2 artillery units who had been smuggled into Goa disguised as soccer teams. Portuguese civilian evacuation. The military build-up created panic amongst Europeans in Goa, who were desperate to evacuate the families before the commencement of hostilities. On the 9th of December, the vessel India arrived at Goa's Mormugao Airport en route to Lisbon from Timor, despite orders from the Portuguese government in Lisbon not to allow anyone to embark on this vessel. The Governor-General of Goa, Manuel Vassalo e Silva, allowed 700 Portuguese civilians of European origin to board the ship and flee Goa. The ship had capacity for only 380 passengers, and was filled to its limits, with evacuees occupying even the ship's toilets. On arranging this evacuation of women and children, Vassalo e Silva remarked to the press, "If necessary, we will die here." Evacuation of European civilians continued by air even after the commencement of Indian airstrikes. Indian reconnaissance operations. Indian reconnaissance operations had commenced on the 1st of December, when 2 Indian Leopard-class frigates, the Innsbruck and the Innsbys, undertook linear patrolling of the Goa coast at a distance of 8 miles. By the 8th of December, the Indian Air Force had commenced baiting missions and fly-by-wires to lure out Portuguese air defenses and fighters. On the 17th of December, a tactical reconnaissance flight conducted by Squadron LDRIS Lauren in a Vampire NF-54 night fighter over Dabalim Airport in Goa was met with 5 rounds fired from a ground anti-aircraft gun. The aircraft took evasive action by drastically dropping altitude and escaping out to sea. The anti-aircraft gun was later recovered near the ATC building with a round jammed in its breech. The Indian light aircraft carrier INS Vikrant was deployed 75 miles off the coast of Goa to head a possible amphibious operation on Goa, as well as to deter any foreign military intervention.